Welcome, everybody. My name is Emily Farnworth. I'm the co-director of the Climate Engagement Centre at Hughes at the University of Cambridge. I'm delighted to be here as co-host of the Cambridge Zero Policy Forum as part of a broader series of events happening with the Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival this week. It's been an incredible range of events that have been going on in the last week, and this is the final day, so hopefully you'll be able to join the various webinars that are available for you today. I'm delighted to be here with an incredible lineup of speakers to talk about the importance of local authorities in tackling climate change. As I'm sure most of you tuning in will know, there's the International Climate Conference going on in Glasgow next month is really raising awareness of what's happening at the international level, with countries coming up with their new targets and goals. But ultimately, we need to understand how this is going to play out to implement on the ground, and local authorities and local partners have such a hugely important role to play. So it's wonderful to be here with the Cambridge Zero Policy Forum to talk about this important topic. Initially, just to introduce you to the various panelists that I'll be talking to, we have Cheryl French, who's Assistant Director of Climate Change and Energy Services at Cambridgeshire County Council. We have Councillor Rosie Moore, who's the Executive Councillor for Climate Change, the Environment and City Centre and Cambridge City Council, and Dr. Ethan Haynes, Research Assistant at the Centre for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall. All incredibly important voices in the focus on local engagement on climate action. So in terms of the panel today, I'm going to start by introducing each of the panelists and for you to hear from them in their own words, what their role is and how this focuses on climate excellence. And I also then will talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities and challenges facing local authorities. And I'll then open up the conversation to questions from the audience. So wonderful to be here. And also I should mention the sort of support that we've had through the Centre for Science and Policy, which is the other co-host of the Cambridge Zero Policy Forum. So just to kick off, maybe if I'll turn to Cheryl first. If you can just kind of give a short overview of your role and some of the key priorities you see for tackling climate change in that context.
Okay, thank you. And it's great to be here talking to everybody. So I'm Cheryl French, and as Emily mentioned, I head up the Climate Change and Energy Services at Cambridgeshire County Council. So what does that mean? So what it means is that I work with politicians, elected politicians, on their climate change strategy and environment strategies. We work together and collaborate on what do carbon targets look like for Cambridgeshire and for ourselves. We look at what are the types of projects that we can deliver ourselves in our organisation to cut carbon emissions, as an example. So we're looking at taking out gas and oil from our buildings and decarbonising our heating, as an example. But we also look at places like our farm estate and on our adult social care, how we can look to design out and avoid carbon emissions through the services that we deliver. I think one of the key areas of work that is really important is looking at how the organisation needs to change. There are many, many systems running within a large organisation. You've got business planning, you've got procurement, you've got commercial investments, you've got HR and people management processes. All of these systems are important to people. And so one of the major areas of work is how do you embed climate change into all those different policies and systems that currently exist in organizations, and ensure that everybody is trying to work to the same carbon reductions, not just those few people who have climate in their title. So that's my role. It's trying to work with people across the organisation, help them understand carbon and to get projects moving forward.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. You make it sound so simple. Oh,
Sorry.
Go on, carry on. Sorry, I thought you'd pause then, but I think it was just a
Yeah,
little.
so just two things then. What are the key priorities for us? And I think the big thing is, how do we set an example to others? You know, if we're not making change and looking as community leaders, how will others also want to progress down this agenda and make emissions reductions? And the other thing is how do we work as with all the professionals across businesses in our communities to say, how do we upskill, how do we support and share with each other how to upskill? And if we're looking at how we work with communities, there is a lot more work we need to do to challenge and harness the ideas and, I suppose, energy of our communities to be able to get them making a difference. So those are sort of some of the big things that we're looking at the moment.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's thank you so much. It's really incredible to hear everything that's going on already, and I know we'll get into a bit more detail. We also have Rosie Moore, who I know unfortunately is having a few problems with her video, but hopefully, Rosie, you're fine on audio. So I would love to go across to you and just for you to tell us a little bit more about your role and some of the priorities that you have.
Yes, thank you. Sorry that my video is not working. I'm Rosie Moore and I'm the Executive Councillor with responsibility for climate change at Cambridge City Council, as well as the Environment and City Centre. So in March of this year, we revised our climate change strategy and carbon management plan, and our new strategy runs from March of this year when we agreed it until 2026. This new strategy has 6 key objectives for the council, but it is a dynamic document as we're always looking for new actions that we can take to achieve our objectives. And every year at our Environment and Communities Committee, we report on how well the strategy is going and update our list of actions. So our key priorities are set out in the strategy are to reduce emissions from our own estate and operations, whilst maintaining vital services to residents across the city. And this is covered by our carbon management plan. Our other priorities are to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions from homes and buildings in Cambridge, reduce emissions from transport in the city, shift to a circular economy by reducing consumption of resources, reducing waste and increasing recycling, promote sustainable food, and last but certainly not least, support council services, residents and businesses to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In this strategy, we've also committed to becoming a net zero carbon council by 2030, and we've set an aspiration for Cambridge to be a net zero carbon city also by 2030, but we really can't do that one on our own, as we need support from government, all of our local partners, including the County Council, who we have here with Sheryl, the Combined Authority, plus local businesses, organisations and residents. So carbon emissions in Cambridge have reduced by over a third over the last 14 years. However, the vast majority of this is due to the decarbonisation of electricity and the increased use of renewables at a national level, not from carbon reduction measures taken here in the city. So in order to ensure that those emissions keep falling, we're going to have to make some big changes to how we live, work and travel. Our previous climate change strategies were much more focused on reducing our own emissions as a council, and we've been quite successful in that, with our emissions in 2021 being 44.3% lower than in 2014-15. Although last year was an exceptional year due to the pandemic, with our swimming pools, which are our biggest carbon emitters, being closed for months. So unfortunately, we may not see that same rate of reduction next year, although we do already have a project in place to install a number of air source heat pumps at our pools by March next year. And these added together should reduce the council's emissions, with the pools being open and in use, by nearly 10%. So the new strategy keeps going with this work on our own carbon management plan, but it really increases what we're doing with our partners to reduce emissions across the city. And although we're working on all of our objectives all at the same time, we're doing quite a lot on retrofit. So we've commissioned 2 studies on retrofit, one to look at the 7 archetypes of council housing, and the other to look at the 10 most common archetypes of private housing in Cambridge. And these studies will recommend the best options to retrofit each. And so they'll give a head start to landlords and homeowners when retrofitting their property. And through this new strategy, we're also increasing our public engagement on our own as a council, but also alongside our partners. And an excellent example of this is with our Cambridge Climate Charter, which we're running with Cambridge Carbon Footprint, where you can measure your own carbon footprint as an individual, a family, or as a business. And it gives you suggestions and ways of reducing your carbon footprint, and you commit to put those into action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. Gosh, there's so much going on, and it's really interesting hearing you talk about some of the observations through the pandemic. I had no idea about swimming pools, but I guess it's also kind of gives you an idea as to kind of where some of the areas to focus on might be as well. That was really, really helpful. Just as a final introductory part of this discussion, Dr. Ethan Haynes, I'd love to come over to you and just hear a little bit more about the work that you've been doing in the context of local engagement.
Hi, thanks, Emily. So I'm Ethan, and thank you so much for having me here today. So I work on climate and local policy at the Center for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall, and previously at Cambridge Zero and the Center for Science and Policy here at the university. So I've collaborated with many different layers of local government in our region, from the City Council to the Combined Authority, and particularly on how we think about climate risk in the future. And for me, this really comes back to the idea of to think globally, but act locally. And so when we're thinking about global climate change, efforts like the upcoming COP in Glasgow are going to be extremely important for seeking international alignment on climate. You know, it's vital that policymakers at the highest levels of government around the world commit to really taking this seriously. But equally important is the imperative that we act locally here within our own spheres of influence to combat climate change and to foster resilience in the certainty of future climate-related risks. And that's because we will experience the effects of climate change here in Cambridge, regardless of what happens at COP. Regardless of what climate trajectory we are on, we will experience consequences in the future. And that is because the world has already experienced a significant degree of warming since the pre-industrial era. So as flooding in Western Europe, the United States, and throughout the UK this summer clearly demonstrated, that future may really be closer than we're comfortable admitting. And the more we emit as a global community, the worse these effects will be. As the IPCC report from this summer really made clear, every additional gram of carbon that's emitted hurts, and every mitigation action and every adaptation action helps. So at Cambridge Zero, what we did is we produced a new risk assessment that really formed the basis of the Commission's recommendations on risk and adaptation. That's the Independent Commission on Climate here in the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough region. And that risk assessment was based on the latest models from the Met, the latest climate models. And it showed that due to changes in the character of seasonal precipitation, that is rainfall, we can expect wetter winters, potentially 50% wetter, with much heavier rain at times. And also we're going to experience drier summers in some years, possibly 60% drier overall. And this will lead to much greater incidence of flooding than we've previously seen in some years. And it could lead to drought in others. So Cambridgeshire has this really precarious arrangement as one of the lowest, if not the lowest county in Britain in terms of its overall elevation. Much of the Fenland is already below sea level. So flooding from rainfall, rivers, and potentially even the sea, these all present a real issue because there's nowhere for that water to go quickly, unfortunately. Additionally, we've already experienced the hottest temperatures in Britain. It was nearly 40 degrees centigrade a couple of years ago at the Botanical Gardens here in Cambridge, and we will see more of that in the future. So by 2050, summers that hot could be normal, but potentially they could be much hotter than that as well. And really, one of the important ways we can deal with these risks is to adapt to them now and at the local level, really. Not 10 years from now, and certainly not in 2050. Earlier in October this year, the Environment Agency went so far as to say, adapt or die. So we really urgently need to be thinking about this. We need to be urgently thinking about how we adapt our built environment, our cities. They need to be cooler in the summer. They need to drain more readily. And we need to become much better stewards of our precious water resources. The good news is, from my experience, local government is taking these issues extremely seriously. And indeed, really, I think the most ambitious climate proposals we have seen have been at the local level around Britain. And I know that this region would really like to see itself become a leader on these issues, and not just here, but really a global leader. I'm from California, and I just want to say that what we're doing here in this region is so far ahead of anything that we have in California, and certainly in the United States overall. And so there really is already a lot to be hopeful for and to be proud of in terms of what the region is doing to combat these issues. Thanks.
Wow, that's quite a testament to think that we're doing more than California, because, you know, I know in the US context, they're certainly out there as a leader. So thank you for that, Ethan. And you also highlight this important, you mentioned this sort of, you know, this discomfort that we have with the reality of how challenging the situation is and how quickly things could get much worse. But by the same token, we need to make sure that we instill a sense of, you know, agency, I suppose, particularly in a local community sense, so that, you know, we don't just all throw up our hands and kind of, you know, do nothing, but we actually need to be able to engage people so that we can kind of, you know, address some of these challenges in quite a tricky kind of context. So maybe just, you know, taking that into consideration, Cheryl, I'd love to come back to you. And, you know, we've obviously heard a lot about the sort of the challenges, I suppose, in the physical context, you know, in the changing environment that we're dealing with. We've heard a little bit about the context in terms of the, you know, the kind of physical environment that we know that we are situated in here in Cambridgeshire. But from your perspective, you know, where do you see this sort of, you know, some of the, you know, maybe just building on some of the challenges in the context of how, you know, how you need to tackle things, but also some of those opportunities that we can maybe focus on in terms of, you know, ensuring we do get that engagement and kind of, you know, keep people focused on having this sort of sense of optimism that there's still, you know, still time for us to turn things around. It would be great to just hear some perspectives from you on that.
Okay, so I think so. We've got three pieces here. We've got the issue of mitigation. So where you're just looking to cut carbon emissions or avoid carbon emissions to prevent further climate risk, which is what Ethan was highlighting very significantly. Then you've got the issue of adaptation, and as Ethan and Rosie have identified, you've got the retrofit agenda potentially, you've got managing flood risk, how you also plan out through your planning processes some of those impacts that are going to come forward. And then you've got what we call the natural capital agenda, which actually crosses both. And natural capital allows us, if we start reinstating it, starts to help us to manage some of those impacts through adaptation, but also manages mitigation, which is storing carbon. So if I look at the first issue on mitigation, the big challenge we've got is retrofitting our buildings and transport. And so the challenge of retrofitting, so for Rosie, who's got significant numbers of council homes, but also for all of us, we've got significant private homes. And in Cambridgeshire, we've got more than 10,000 homes which are off gas grid. So we've got burning oil in old leaky homes. And how do you get your communities embracing change and taking on new technologies, so moving from what they've always had onto something new? So one example that we've been working with is a village called Swap and Prior, and it's about a village to take the whole village off of oil and onto renewables, so using ground source and air source heat pumps plus solar PV. Now, why that's interesting is we've got a sense of urgency here. Most of us understand that we've got to start cutting emissions during these next 10 years. And so how do you do things at scale? So by using mechanisms like finance incentives to give people choice to come along and make different environmental choices to change their home is a drip feed over time. But how is it we're going to get people mobilized more quickly? So all of us have heard of the building and heat strategy just coming through. I think we're all going to devour that over the next couple of weeks and see what more we can do. When it comes to adaptation, you know, we did suffer significant floods during December, and my colleagues at Cambridgeshire County Council and with our partners have been working out, well, how do we now look at designing some of that out? What are the issues that contributed to that? And when we start thinking about planning, how we manage our our nature consequences here, to start adapting to those impacts, we've got to do a lot more. So then I look at, well, what is it that we do in Cambridgeshire? We have quite a lot of land, we have a lot of farmland, we have agriculture. So there's a lot of agri-tech business, which is looking at how do we start farming in different ways? How are we more sensitive? We have significant peatland assets in Cambridgeshire. And, you know, peatland can be an amazing store of carbon, but it's also, if it's farmed in certain ways, can also be a major carbon outlet. So there's enough to keep us all busy, I can assure you. But there's also a very strong drive on tree planting to store water, to hold water back when you've got flood water coming through, you know, planting grasslands to hold and store water. These things that have been lost during, let's say, the building over a lot of areas, or, you know, just putting tarmac paths down, individuals in their gardens choosing to have less of a garden and more of a patio, as an example. But how do people react and what do they do? I think there's a lot of people out there who've got good ideas and want to do something.
Yeah.
Their challenge is sometimes knowing where to start, because they might not have the influence over infrastructure. So, you know, if it's a road, it might be either a policy issue or a maintenance issue. They don't necessarily have the ability to invest in change, like going into solar panels or air source heat pumps. And so nature is often a way that they can engage, you know, whether they're looking at hedges, cultivating their gardens. So
Oh, are you losing you a little bit, Cheryl? Can you still hear me?
Emily? Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. I was actually just curious. I think you're at this point around sort of needing to get creative and needing to engage kind of communities, and this balancing act between where there's, you know, ownership and people can actually do something. I'm just really intrigued with the Swaffham example that you gave. Was that a sort of community-led activity, and, you know, what kind of was the stimulus for that?
Well, it was a community land trust who were very active. And this is where communities can be very clever, because we published our corporate energy strategy, and they saw that we'd put an objective in there, which was we will use our rural estate or our assets to support community energy projects. And so they approached us with their project idea, and we collaborated over the last 4 years to bring a project forward in the village. Now, with any village, you get the people who are pioneering at the front, and you'll get the people who are saying, well, is it ever going to happen? And I'm not going to commit until I know there's a bit more certainty. And then there'll always be the others, which will come in over time, or not at all. So it is quite interesting on a community level, working on projects.
Yeah. No, it's really good.
But where we're at, just so you know.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
So we're just currently digging the district heat network throughout the village, and we've got the energy centre. So we've got on order a significant air source and ground source heat pump, and boreholes will be starting to be drilled in January. So it's really happening right now. And from March, April next year, we're expecting, you know, carbon emission reductions, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I would love now to turn to Rosie, and I'm sure some of those issues around retrofitting homes, thinking about new transport systems, you know, thinking about community projects that are obviously all areas that you're very engaged in as well. But it would be great to get your thoughts on, from your personal perspective, you know, where you're seeing some of the bigger challenges, but also importantly, I guess, some of the bigger opportunities as well.
Thank you. And sorry, my camera's still not working. Yes, so I think that there are, obviously we do have huge challenges. I would say that funding for all of this is a huge challenge for us as a council. We've had 10 years of austerity, plus then the pandemic. So budgets are really stretched, but also the costs of retrofitting are ginormous. A conservative estimate that each home would cost £50,000 to retrofit means that in Cambridge we would need £2.56 billion to retrofit all homes. So obviously the council doesn't have that sort of money, and so we really need new sources of income to put that in place. But it's not just funding. With retrofit, we've got a shortage of skills. Unfortunately, we've got a really tight deadline. We really need to be getting on with this now if we're going to achieve our targets. But we must make sure that we do it well, otherwise we'll be creating a whole new set of problems for ourselves and also for our residents. But there are also, I would say, huge opportunities. If, for example, we retrofit homes, then we could save people on a low income money on their bills, but also we can create homes that are healthy and warm for people to live in. I think on transport, we can improve the livability of our city. We can clean up the air. There are a number of proposals around climate change to move to a shorter working week. So we could totally transform the way that we live for the better. But obviously it has to be done thoughtfully and carefully to ensure a just transition, so that we don't increase inequalities across not just our own city and country, but across the world. Because of course, although we are feeling climate change already here in Cambridge, you know, Cambridge was where we have measured the highest temperatures in the UK, but we're not nearly affected as people are around the world, facing drought, facing floods and storms. And so we do need to work towards a just transition, but I feel that that's a real opportunity on combating climate change.
Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point there, which was the sort of the scale of the need for retrofitting buildings, just to take one of the particular sort of mitigation measures that we need to take, is a huge cost. But I guess on the flip side, you could also argue that that's a sort of huge opportunity for new jobs to be created, and for that money to then, you know, flow into sort of, you know, what will translate into new salaries and business growth opportunities. So I guess it's just trying to get that balance right of thinking how we stimulate that.
Absolutely, we really need to increase skills, particularly on retrofit, but in other areas of the green economy. But yes, there's an opportunity for not just increased jobs, but high quality jobs, and that have although we need to start retrofitting now, we've got a long way to go. So they're good, high quality jobs into the future.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those insights. And maybe Ethan, you know, listening to Cheryl and Rosie, and also I know that you've been working very closely with the Cambridge and Peterborough Commission. Anything you want to sort of add to in terms of some of these sort of, this duality of some of these big challenges, but also some of the opportunities that we have in the area as well?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, we have two pretty big challenges right now. The first, echoing Rosie, is that while local authorities are proposing some really ambitious solutions to climate change, they really need more help from central government. So at the launch of the new independent commission recommendations this past Monday, Baroness Brown went so far as to say local authorities still have one hand tied behind their back because they need further devolved powers, they need more funding, and they need greater clarity from central government. So that really is one of the challenges. But the second challenge is lucidly communicating these climate risks that I've spoken about and actions that we can actually be taking, like you raised, to enable agency so that the public can feel like they're taking their part in adaptation. So the more people understand about climate risk and adaptation, the more they can be empowered to take action. The Independent Commission on Climate made this one of their central recommendations on adaptation, really, the need for greater communication. So there's some really simple things that you can do right now in your own home to start thinking about climate adaptation. And so I just like to highlight some of these things. So the first thing is that you can think about how you use water and use it more wisely. If you go on Anglia Water's webpage, Love Every Drop, they have some great simple tips for just reducing water consumption around the house. That's going to be really important as we need to manage our water more wisely. Of course, it's important for new developments in the region to be more water efficient from the outset. But for those of us living in older homes, it's equally important. You can also think about how you use water in your garden. And this is another really important thing that people need to be doing to adapt. Planting native species, for instance, this can really help with water consumption, but it can also help with adapting and with the nature crisis, which is linked with the climate crisis, right? So planting trees can really help urban cooling in the summer. I know we all cherish our sun in the summer here, but planting trees or just letting them grow naturally. I have squirrels that visit my yard. I have volunteer trees coming up. If one of those is in the right place, let it grow. That's a perfect solution. It will provide more cooling for your house in the summer, and we will need that in the years ahead. And planting natives, avoiding using any chemicals, letting trees grow, these are all things that can really help with that biodiversity and help climate. It doesn't have to be expensive, and there's a lot of wonderful native plants and species that you can grow from seed. I'm an avid gardener, and I'm very passionate about this, but you also don't have to hardscape your garden. A lot of people have been paving over their gardens, and I think, as Cheryl mentioned, this really doesn't help with runoff flooding. This is one of the types of flooding where it rains very hard and the water has nowhere to go. So, let things grow. You can encourage wildlife, that helps. If you love hedgehogs like I do, you can go on Hedgehog Street and check out some great tips for encouraging all kinds of wildlife in your garden. And I think that local government can really help this by pointing people in the right directions for adaptation actions. As Rosie said, they already have a fantastic mitigation webpage that I think everybody should do if they live in Cambridge, the Cambridge Carbon Footprint. But there can also be more pointers for people to take adaptation actions as well, but many of them overlap, I think, as Cheryl said. So I think really this is the greatest opportunity. It's that we have the chance to make our communities more livable. We have the chance to help nature in our own gardens. You can imagine this like tapestry of wildlife across the city. And we can use adaptation and mitigation to really achieve cleaner, more livable cities. We can improve our own health and well-being in all of this. So there can really be some wonderful benefits. And I think people do have a lot of agency in terms of the actions they can take to help see this become a reality.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. I love this sort of sense of I think some of these, and Cheryl and Rosie have mentioned it too. I mean, some of these sort of more nature-based solutions that we have as things that we can just get on with, appreciating that it's not going to be that alone that's going to solve the problem, but at least there are things that we can do today. And as we sort of wait for some of these larger opportunities and technologies to become more available over time. Just something else that you brought up that I'd love to get Cheryl and Rosie's perspective on is this issue of sort of, the measures and the policies, and we've seen the UK's new net zero strategy come out this week, what's happening at the kind of national level, and how does this play out in terms of what's happening at the local level? And it sounds like there's some areas that really do need to be improved on in terms of some of the, the ability, I guess, to get things done more locally. I would love, Cheryl and Rosie, to hear your kind of views on what is good that's happening now, but what you'd like to see more of in the future. Maybe Cheryl, to turn to you first.
I think one of the big challenges is the competition for resources. So the current regime being put forward through government is to put significant levels of money into different funding pots, and then the local authorities effectively submit and compete for that funding. The problem with it is it doesn't give any longevity. And you also end up with some of the local authorities that have got greater levels of resource or are more organised around it, winning more money. Now, on the one hand, that might be seen as a good thing, because you're saying, well, people are ready earlier, we can manage supply chain. But the big challenge is that everybody's got to do it all and fast and as quickly as possible. Accepting where we are with the skills challenge that Rosie's highlighted and the supply chain. So I think long-term funding is a critical aspect. There is also that issue about what is the role of local government when there aren't any, let's say, statutory duties to deliver. So from central government, there's a national target, but there isn't any compulsion for us to deliver. So when you have got very stretched budgets, you've got adult social care budgets, you've got waste budgets, you've got transport budgets, it is a very challenging position to basically identify you're going to avoid future costs as your funding model. Because, what Ethan was highlighting is that the climate risks are going to get worse if you do nothing. We are all going to be paying more. So you've got to do something. And how do you afford that? And what are the mechanisms to afford that?
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? In terms of kind of, well, a couple of the things you've mentioned there in terms of, competition for funding, but also this need to have those statutory requirements, I guess, feels like quite an important piece to sort of, to work on. Rosie, anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, I would really agree with Cheryl about the competitive nature, but also the fact that it's very stop-start. So, for example, I'll go back to Retrofit, the Green Homes scheme. Councils had 3 weeks to apply. We had to have, it was quite a large minimum amount, so smaller councils like ours needed to work together with other councils, which that in itself isn't a bad thing, but it means that you can't apply on your own. And actually a very short time frame to complete the work. Well, as I said, we've got a shortage of skills. If you've just got these very short stop-start projects, that is not the right environment to encourage, to actually get the numbers of homes retrofitted that we need to, but also to build the skills, because businesses, they just can't work in that way, and neither can councils. We really need long-term funding that not just councils, but also that homeowners themselves know what's coming over the next 10 years, because of course, it won't just be about councils, but also private homeowners need to know whether suddenly there's going to be a government scheme next week and actually they shouldn't put any of their own private money into it, or actually there's a certain level of support. It's going to be available for 10 years and this is how you can access it.
Yeah, it really does get down to that level of practicality, doesn't it? And I've luckily the team has been busily sort of feeding me some questions, and so maybe if I can open it up now to some of the questions that have been coming through. So one, actually you actually kind of already referenced it, is this collaboration that goes on between local authorities. And I don't know, Rosie, just maybe to go to you first, because you brought it up around this sort of the approach around putting in for funding. But what are you seeing that's currently really encouraging about some of the collaboration that's going on? And is there more that you'd like to see happening into the future?
Yes, so we collaborate with a number of councils. We, for example, are a part of UK 100, so that's with councils all across the country, mostly on lobbying government for the things that we need to work on clean air, but also on climate change. And yes, we're also working with our local councils. So we've got a number of projects with the county council, number of projects with South Cambs, and the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Climate Commission, I think, is a real opportunity to really increase that collaboration, learn from each other, because on this, there's really no point in reinventing the wheel. If there's another council doing it and we can do it, great, let's just learn from each other, and because we really need action. So yes, I'm all in favour of increased collaboration.
Thank you, Rosie. And Cheryl, from your perspective?
Well, we know that delivering even net zero by 2050 in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is going to be difficult. If we don't align and we don't collaborate, it just makes it even harder. It's all the same carbon, it's the same emissions. So it makes sense that we can align targets, align projects, build on the skill sets that everybody's got. And I think more importantly, it's also how do we support those businesses and communities that need to be with us on that journey. But yeah, I agree with Rosie on her points.
Thank you for that. I don't know, Ethan, just in terms of what you've seen already with regards to the commission, whether there's anything coming out of their report that talks about this sort of cross local authority collaboration being part of what needs to happen next as well.
Yeah, it's just, I completely agree with Cheryl and Rosie on this point, and it's not my main topic of study, but I think that each of the layers of local government has their own powers and levers that they can pull, and they're not all the same. So this kind of joined up approach and this collaboration is extremely key, I think, to solving this.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just to turn to a different question. You've all talked about various things that local residents can do, but maybe to even be a little bit more specific, if somebody has an hour a week to spend on doing something that will really kind of improve the local situation, either on a individual level or in the context of sort of working across what's needed across the local authority, what would your recommendations be of the way that they should spend their time, or the things that they need to do? Maybe Cheryl, I'll come to you first. well,
that's a hard one, because
it's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it?
It is, but I do think people need to look at their carbon footprint, and really understand how they can cut without feeling that they're wearing a hair shirt. Because I think one of the big challenges here is when I speak to my nieces, as an example, what their aspirations are. It means that they're happy to turn vegan, they're happy to walk and cycle more. The one thing that they really find challenging is to not go on holidays. And so what we've got to try and work out is, what are our individual motivations, and how can we cut as much as possible through the bits that we like doing. And then obviously those bits that are less attractive, we've also got to think about a cultural change, fast fashion, moving from individualism to community collective work, trying to think about buying your food locally, as an example. I mean, there are so many things that we can all do, but it's how we all tap into our own, I suppose, emotions and motivations around it.
Yeah, no, I think you really kind of hit an important point there, which is choose things that you actually would quite enjoy doing that are going to have a kind of co-benefit of emissions reductions. I mean, I know, for example, you know, thinking about, for me personally, the idea of thinking about turning down the temperature on a shower just is like something I really don't want to have to do, but switching to a renewable energy tariff, yes, I'm all in for that. So I get that kind of, you know, balancing act of choosing things that you know, that you actually will find quite exciting. And even, I mean, I know friends of mine who, you know, to your point about veganism, you know, it's not something that they necessarily feel they could do 100% of the time, but actually choosing specific days or thinking about it in a certain context so that you can do, you know, the sort of flexitarianism that's kind of, you know, evolving at the moment is you know, is exactly the sort of thing that people can start thinking about. Rosie, I've given you a bit of extra time to think about how you'd answer that question, but what would you say?
So I would agree wholeheartedly, and people can use the Cambridge Climate Charter to give them some tips on how to reduce their own and find ways that they would enjoy or wouldn't find so challenging, although obviously we will need to do those more challenging things in time. I would also say that I just think all of us need to be better educated on this. And I think certainly if as a society that we were, then we would all be pushing government to do more and shopping more ethically, traveling differently. So I think you can use the same idea of finding the area that you're most interested in and just get better educated on that. Read books and hopefully speak to others about it, because we do really need to be talking about this much more, but things are changing so fast that you can't be up to date on everything. And so we need as many people to be as interested and knowledgeable as we can.
Yeah, it's so important. And I read that the ITV has got a whole climate program kind of going on throughout COP. So I would imagine that that's going to be playing a role in helping to communicate much more broadly. I would imagine, you know, listening to it on Coronation Street gets to a different group than perhaps those of us that, you know, are kind of a bit more into the sort of science journals. So I think it'll be really helpful to that point of kind of just getting to know what's going on. Ethan, is there anything else that you wanted to add? I mean, you talked a lot about the sort of nature solutions earlier, but are there other things that you would kind of want to put up on the list?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that would echo the other panelists and something that Rhiannon Osborne, one of the other commissions, said on Monday at the launch of the new report, which is that these actions have to make sense in your life. I could say use the extra hour a week to walk to work, but for a lot of people that might not be a viable option. So you have to find things that work for you. And I would say for young people in particular, I know that this situation is very depressing. I've read that, and I know that it affects a lot of young people. They feel like I have no future. But just to say that there are things that you can be doing at the local level that do make an impact. And there are things that you can be doing in your community, whether or not that's, you know, joining a community garden, taking actions in your own garden if you are lucky enough to own one, that can really improve mental health and make you feel like you have an impact. And it does have an impact, because also your actions will influence hopefully the people around you, the people in your lives, the people in your family, your friends. And those are all small things that we can be doing, I think, every day.
Yeah. Rosie, did you want to come in here?
Yes, please. I just wanted to say I would also I think that more could be done maybe in people's work. In my past 2 jobs, I worked for very environmentally friendly businesses, and I suppose I was in a bit of a bubble. And I got a new job this year, and it's been quite shocking, the disinterest and at work. So I think that the workplace could be a really good arena to, for example, promote recycling. We can think about how people get to work, reducing food waste, promoting sustainable food. So I think Yeah, if you, depending on where you work, maybe if you work in Cambridge University Climate Zero, you don't have those same opportunities, but for other people, work could be a good place.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think it's just this important fact of it's not just a kind of hat that you put in when you go home or a hat that you put on when you go to work, you know, depending on, you know, which of those things is sort of where you think about climate action the most, but actually it's throughout your lives and thinking about the influence that you have on others. And there was a point that was raised on another panel that we had around, you know, your voting, you know, rights. You have a voice in the context of sort of how to use your vote, and all of these things are really important in terms of driving change. Cheryl, did you have something else to add?
Yes, it was just about sort of, I suppose, more around our economic models that we work in currently. And it was just saying that, you know, we haven't valued nature. We've used nature. We haven't valued carbon. And when you're trying to make choices, it's very difficult for people when they're looking at whatever they might want to buy to understand which is more impactful on the environment, which one's going to create more carbon emissions. So I think the issue of education, learning some of the language around carbon is quite important, because there is a new language emerging or technical language emerging, but we've got to get to the point of knowing how to value the environment alongside the financial value of goods and services, because otherwise we're not going to drive the change that we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple of last questions before we close. A question that's come in here around sort of how do sort of parts of the country that maybe you know, have got opportunities to increase mitigation can work with parts of the country that maybe have got bigger challenges. I mean, you know, just in particular, I guess, in a kind of city context, the question has come up around some certain cities that have really challenging air pollution challenges, for example. You know, are there kind of across the UK sort of city to city or council to council projects that are going on to enable that learning in different parts of the country? I don't know, Cheryl, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite, I mean, Rosie mentioned UK 100, but there are other groups as well where there's local authorities working across either urban areas or rural areas. And I think there's a big challenge on both sides, both urban and rural. So when you look at funding tends to be organised into cities, because you've got high densities of homes, you've got high densities of people, you've got transport, and so commercially they seem more viable compared to when you're looking into some of the rural areas. It was the same for when digital infrastructure was coming forward, because it's not as commercially viable, that can be left behind. And so I think there's a strong drive from rural communities to have their voice within this discussion. But then on the other hand, they have got land and they've got more nature, and there's space for other opportunities. So it is quite important that rural and urban communities work together. And I think this issue of where there might be opportunity in one area and not in another, there's opportunity in all areas. But some could be harder and more costly. And how do we balance that out? That is a challenge.
Yeah. Rosie, anything you want to add from your experience?
Just that there are ways of learning from each other, but they're not really formal ways. It's more, well, the internet is a really useful tool, but also going to conferences and events. The local government association does share some information. I am a Labour councillor, so we share our own Labour local government association share best practice. But this is totally different and we need to respond in a different way. So it would be good if there was a way of having more formal ways of learning best practice. So if anyone's got a solution or any projects that other councils are doing and you think that we could learn from that, then we would certainly be very open to that at Cambridge.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to squeeze in one final question. So this, you've talked a lot about sort of the role of local authorities, inevitably, it's the focus, but I guess I'll try and combine a couple of questions in one. But this idea of other partners that you need to work with, the business community, other kind of civil society groups, and I guess in the context of delivering on projects, but also thinking about potential crowdfunding or private public funding models to kind of get things done. And maybe I'll come to you first, Ethan, in terms of it, whether or not you've got any, whether you've seen any kind of good examples, or whether or not you have any thoughts on thinking about the sort of multiple partnership opportunities and need really to sort of think about this, the way that we need to get things done together.
Right. I think that I don't know much about funding, but I can say that it's very important for regions to be working with their universities. I think that's something I'd like to highlight. That's obviously something that we do at the Center for Climate Engagement and across the university. We've been working with all these different layers of government. Universities hold deep expertise on certain topics, and the UK has a fantastic network of universities. It doesn't have to be Cambridge. And additionally, local policymakers have this really rich and deep experience of actually getting things done that I think academics can learn from as well. So it's a really wonderful transfer. And I think it's really important to highlight that I think more needs to be done in that area throughout the UK.
And Rosie, I'll come to you next. What's your suggestion here?
So I agree that we really need to find new ways of funding. We set up at the City Council a street trees fund. I think it was just before the pandemic, and I have asked that should be something that individuals who want more street trees in Cambridge, obviously it's much more expensive to plant a tree on the pavement than it is on green grass, that it would be good if individuals or businesses in the city would like to support that. I think things like retrofit, obviously it just needs to be on a much larger scale, but I would support, I think, everything that we need to focus primarily on reducing our emissions, but at some point there might need to be some sort of offsetting. So I would support a local offsetting scheme. And there are other sources of funding that we are looking into.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Cheryl, finally to you, what thoughts and suggestions would you have, or what's already happening that you've seen that's sort of about multi-stakeholder collaboration?
Okay, so just echoing both Ethan and Rosie, collaboration is the only way we're going to manage this challenge, using the expertise of researchers. So, for example, we're working with the Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange, CUSPI, which you're a part of. We're currently working on a project which is a Cambridgeshire decarbonisation fund, and what the model for that could look like, which would be what Rosie's talking about, a local carbon offset fund, where you've got big businesses supporting smaller businesses and potentially supporting local projects to decarbonise. So I think finding those things where you can engage the skill sets of big businesses, small businesses and communities is really important. Yeah. The other thing that I think is required is that, we have at Cambridgeshire County Council, we have significant buying power. So we work with large organisations, small organisations, and the collaborations we're now doing in terms of market research on if we're going to be asking for these sort of different services or redesigning our services or cutting carbon emissions, how do we work with you business to make that happen and cut your carbon footprint? Because some of them are further ahead than we are. And so it would be good to learn from them, but also is to send market signals to say we're coming to start driving hard on carbon reductions or adaptation.
So
I suppose what I'm saying is that as many collaborations as possible to learn from each other.
Perfect. Well, I think that's an ideal note to end on. You're right. We're not going to get through this unless we collaborate. So thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our collaborators at the Centre for Science and Policy for this really enjoyable webinar, and would encourage everyone to look out at other events that are happening in the final day of the Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival. So thank you to our wonderful panelists today, to Sheryl and to Rosie and to Ethan. Really hope everyone watching this has enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you all very, very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Emily.